Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, distinguished delegates. I call to order the 19th plenary meeting of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. At this point, the conference will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9 and Cluster 6, which includes Articles 11 to 21. From yesterday's meeting, 4 delegations were still on the speakers list to conclude this topic. I now have other delegations who are requesting the floor to discuss this topic. Once we conclude that list of speakers, we would then move to give the floor to civil society. Likewise, you have now had the opportunity to review the revised version of the preamble. I can now explain the modifications that were made. We can do this now together, and later on I think it will be necessary to consult with the Bureau so that, to the extent possible, this morning meeting, that we could conclude this morning meeting a little bit earlier so that I can engage in the consultations with the Bureau. So we will proceed as follows. We will first listen to the speakers who remained on the speakers list yesterday afternoon. We have Ecuador, Indonesia, Venezuela, and Mexico. I give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador. Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning to you. Good morning to each and every one of you. I would like to briefly refer to and react to a proposal that I heard yesterday regarding Article 19. We were very concerned in my delegation to hear that the proposal aimed to subordinate the treaty that we are discussing here to other instruments, particularly the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Once this treaty comes into it's as if once this treaty comes into force, it will not have its own life and it will not have its own legal independence, and this is a mistake from a technical perspective. But what concerned us most is that it was even stated that the new treaty, were there a conflict in terms of its interpretation, should be subordinate to the interpretation of the NPT. And we were worried about this because, unfortunately, a few states, due to their own interests, have interpreted the NPT in a way that we are completely in disagreement with. And I recalled that in December of 2006, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, mentioned at the Parliament, so it was not a personal statement, but rather an official statement, that, and I would like to read this in English for you. Under the NPT,
those who are the major nuclear powers can remain nuclear powers.
2 months later, the Prime Minister Blair once again at Parliament mentioned in February of 2007,
NPT makes it absolutely clear that Britain has the right to possess nuclear weapons.
Of course, I cannot state if that is the position, or if it still is the official position of the government of the United Kingdom or of other nuclear weapon states that are parties to the NPT, but we have heard these types of arguments and these types of interpretations. This interpretation is a mistake in our view, but there we have a question. Does this mean that the proposal that the NPT, or rather that the treaty that we are discussing right now and that will come into force, should be subject to that interpretation? My delegation is thinking, we're considering if the proposal regarding Article 19, should that proposal be eliminated from the draft? That is our question. Because it is complicating the discussion and it is generating confusion regarding legal realities. There are general standards for interpretation and general standards in terms of the coordination between treaties. Of course, we have not made a decision on this article in our national capacity because we are carefully following other proposals. That was presented by Malaysia, for example, we think is very interesting. So because we think that it better organizes the various issues, but I think we have to be very careful. My delegation, Ecuador's delegation, did not come here to negotiate a protocol of another instrument. We came to negotiate a separate, independent instrument, even though it is, of course, related to and it is part of the larger architecture of nuclear disarmament. Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank the delegation of Ecuador for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Indonesia, followed by Venezuela, Mexico, Fiji, Singapore, and Thailand.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to everyone. Madam Chair, Madam President, allow me to make some brief comments on a number of articles that have been discussed since yesterday. On Article 11, we do support the suggestion made by previous delegations to make this article and as well as paragraph 1 and 2 to be more specific in terms of addressing the subject matter of this. For instance, there needs to be a clear subject as to who has the right to propose amendments. I think this should be specifically clarified. Secondly, on Article 11, I do support suggestions made by previous delegations to that amendment should be adopted more than 2/3. I think there was a proposal to have it 3/4, and this is something that we could live with. And then finally, on Article 11, we do support the Irish proposal with regards to optional protocol, so as leaving us more room to discuss in the future for the possibility of having an optional protocol of this treaty. On Article 13, with regards to universality, we do support this current paragraph as it is drafted now, but we do believe that that this paragraph could be further strengthened as to make it more proactive. We do support the logic that was suggested by the delegation of Egypt yesterday to replace attracting with other words that was proposed yesterday. But on this specific paragraph, as I mentioned earlier, we do want it to make it more proactive. So we would like to propose one word in this paragraph, and that word is to promote. So not only to encourage states, but also to promote. So it would read as follows: each state party shall promote and encourage, so as to make it more proactive and so as to make it more engaging in terms of how we advocate the need to have complete universality of this treaty. Madam President, I'd like to proceed now to Article 18. We do subscribe the logic that was presented by the esteemed delegation of Liechtenstein on the need to simplify the paragraphs under Article 18. But I do want to register our view on this particular article, specifically on withdrawal. We do believe that it is the sovereign right of each state party to withdraw However, we do want to point out that this should be done in the most proper way, because for us, we view that withdrawal of this treaty would somewhat constitute a threat to international peace and security. So I think there should be provisions there that would not necessarily create additional burden or hurdles for states to withdraw, but at least this action should be taken very seriously by state members and state parties to this convention. Next is on Article 19, Madam President. We've heard many views and many arguments on Article 19. There were some proposals also made with regards to Article 19. We just heard a proposal to, in fact, delete Article 19. We do see merit of it. We view that based on the Vienna Convention on Laws and Treaties, it notes that when a treaty is subject to another or earlier treaty, then the provisions of that treaty will prevail. So there is, in fact, merit behind the suggestion made by the delegation of Ecuador. But also, on the other hand, we could also explore other possibilities on how to strengthen Article 9. Article 9 relates to existing treaties. The way it is drafted now, it refers to the NPT, and there were also suggestions made yesterday to refer to other treaty, such as the CTBT. But I think there is another way of looking at this Article 19. Article 19 could be defined also when referring to other treaties, could be defined through rights and obligations. I think when it comes to NPT especially, and with relations to this treaty, we need to clearly define them in terms of rights and obligations. And then when it comes to rights, for example, we should clearly stipulate that it is indeed the right of states parties to acquire nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. That is, I think, should be stressed out as the right. And the second part is on the obligations. I think there are many provisions that we can quote, among others, the production, the transfer, the use, the modernization, all that. This could be clarified. This could be specified under the obligations. So essentially, what we are proposing is a new way to define and to look at Article 19, so that it would be compatible to countries that are eventually who will be party to this treaty. I think I leave it at that, Madam President, and I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Indonesia. And I give the floor now to le doy la palabra.
I now give the floor to the delegation of Venezuela. Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning to you and to the members and the various delegations and members of civil society who are accompanying us today. In reference to Article 11, on the amendments to the convention, we share the position of Cuba regarding the need to ensure the rights of states parties to submit proposed amendments to the meeting of states party or the review conference. Thus, we believe that it is necessary to replace the word maybe with should, because we think it provides stronger emphasis, as indicated by other delegations yesterday. In terms of Article 12 on settlement of disputes, as has been mentioned already by some speakers, we believe that we need a sequential focus on the means of dispute settlement. So we believe that first, we should favor direct negotiation, or we should facilitate the resolution of the settlement. Likewise, in terms of the use of the International Court of Justice, this should be based on mutual consent between the parties. In order to simplify this article, we could delete the second paragraph. Article 14, as was expressed by various delegations, I think would be necessary to adjust the language that has been submitted, eliminating the last 5 words before its entry into force. In terms of 17, in terms of the reservation, we believe that this mechanism is related to the convention and other articles. We agree that under the nature and the scope, in terms of peace building, this instrument should be exempt from reservations in step with international law, particularly the Vienna Convention on Treaties. In terms of Article 18, we support the proposal, the Egyptian proposal, to add the title to the for the withdrawal, and also we agree with the guidelines in the first sentence of the second paragraph. We also believe that it is unnecessary to mention the Security Council as the notification body for complaint or withdrawal. In our belief, the reticence of nuclear weapon states who are also permanent members to join this effort to prohibit nuclear weapons remove the content of this. So we could also consider the competence of the General Assembly in dealing with this. We believe that as the General Assembly, through Resolution 21-258, was in fact launched this process that we are engaged in today. So perhaps the General Assembly could take on the responsibilities that would be conferred upon it in this article. Finally, Article 19, regarding the relations with other agreements, we support Cuba's position by adding a reference to treaties on areas, nuclear weapons-free zones. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación de Venezuela. Le doy la palabra a...
Thank you, Venezuela, and I now give the floor to Mexico. Thank you, Madam President. My delegation believes that in Article 11, it should be established that amendments should not go against the principles and purposes of this treaty. Thus, we support the reference that was requested by Malaysia. We also support the modifications that have been proposed by the distinguished delegation of Cuba to Article 17. In Article 18.3, we support Liechtenstein's proposal to replace the 3-month period to a 12-month period. Finally, regarding Article 19, my delegation believes that this should not be limited to the NPT, and it should not affect any treaty in force for the parties that are concerned. Thus, we support Malaysia's proposal in the first paragraph based on Article 26 of the ATT, and that was supported by the delegations of New Zealand, Brazil, and Ireland. Likewise, and in any case, we could support the deletion of this article as was suggested by the delegations of Egypt, Ecuador, and this was supported by Indonesia. Thank you very much. I thank the distinguished delegation of Mexico for that statement.
The floor to the delegation of Fiji.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning. Good morning, fellow delegates, as well as the representatives from civil organizations. My delegation this morning would like to register our support on the concerns and the issues reiterated yesterday by the delegation of the Marshall Islands. Unfortunately, do not have time yesterday to be able to raise this. Would like to register our support in effect for all those concerns. My delegation and, of course, the Pacific as a whole would like to concur with the fact that nuclear testing in the Pacific defines who we are, and that over the years, the threats, the ramifications, and the implications of more than 300 nuclear tests without any compensation to our people and to the basis of our existence, which is the environment, is something that we will continue to ponder upon. The suggested compensation, particularly the means by the Marshall Islands, is also fully supported by my delegation. As you know, Madam President, the Pacific cried foul over the years, and we have the utmost faith in this convention or this treaty to be the game changer, not only to the victims, but for the sustainability of our planet and civilization. In that regard, my delegation essentially supports New Zealand's and other delegates' proposal on Article 17 of the instrument, that states should not be allowed to make reservations of any article of this treaty which ensures consistency, particularly with the weapons-related international agreements, as you know, such as the biological and chemical weapons, the landmines and cluster munitions, as well as the South Pacific Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. My delegation also would like to flag a bit of concern on Article 16, particularly on entry into force, to ensure that the wording somehow guarantees that entry into force must not be contingent upon the ratification of any particular state or group of states. Likewise, Madam President, on Article 19, if the Secretariat could provide some elaboration as to what Article 19 entails, and in case if there are gap exists, particularly on nuclear rearmament, that should be completely eliminated. Article 19 should be completely eliminated. Should there be any gap exist, which will allow for nuclear rearmament. With those words, Madam President, thank you.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación de Fiji. Quisiera...
I thank the distinguished delegate. I would like to go back to what I mentioned to you before when we made the presentation of the content of this section, in the sense that in March, the delegations expressed their interest in an article, an express provision that would leave clear that nothing in this convention would weaken the obligations that the states have undertaken in other legal instruments. So this is an article that would be related to the links with other instruments that are part of the applicable architecture at this time. I also highlighted that we have heard that the wording, the language of this article is not necessarily capturing that feeling, that spirit that was presented at that time, and therefore I even made a proposal at that time in terms of how the conference could understand a way that we could read this article and find language that would be reflective of that. Upon closing the presentation of this cluster, I suggested that perhaps we could prepare. I was ready to hear the various proposals that you may have in order to reword or improve the way in which this article is structured. So, in sum, this is a provision that would respond to the requests and the expressions of states during the month of March, and there is a provision that should clearly state that nothing in this legal instrument would go against the obligations that countries have acquired under other instruments, other legal instruments that they are states party to. And in order for there to be no doubt that there are alternative paths, but rather to show that we are finding a way of supporting and supplementing the current architecture. I now give the floor to the delegation of Singapore, followed by Thailand, Nigeria, and the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, colleagues. Singapore aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of ASEAN on this segment by Malaysia yesterday. We would like to add the following points and proposals in our national capacity. First, we consider that the number of ratifications required for the entry into force of the treaty has been presented is a reasonable number, balancing between the two, perhaps conflicting objectives that has been eloquently laid out by speakers during the debate yesterday. Second, we share concerns raised in relation to the role of the Security Council as contained in paragraph 2 of Article 18. We understand that such a provision is contained in other disarmament treaties, including the CWC. The unique nature of the circumstances we are confronted with, at least for the near future, would call into question the utility of providing notice to the Security Council regarding any state party's intention to withdraw. For this reason, we see merit in further consideration of the suggestion made by Kazakhstan to replace Security Council with General Assembly. Third, almost entirely similar to Cuba's proposal, we have a proposal to make in relation to Article 19. Our proposal, which includes tweaks to Article 19, would read, "Nothing in this convention shall be taken to affect the rights and obligations of the states parties under the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones." I would add that we have heard many good proposals over the course of yesterday's discussion in relation to Article 19, and will consider the proposals that we have tabled in light of the other suggestions. Lastly, we heard a suggestion yesterday to delete Article 13 on universality, Madam President. We attribute the utmost importance to the eventual universalization of the treaty. We are thus of the view that the provision on universalization should be contained in the treaty. Having said that, we remain flexible on the wording and the placement. We have no difficulty with the current formulation to encourage non-states parties to ratify, accept, approve, or accede to the convention, but note that this leaves considerable room for interpretation in practice. One possible way to rectify this, or to strengthen the idea of universalization, is to add a paragraph in the preambular section, similar to language used in the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The paragraph in the preamble that was referred to reads, emphasizing the desirability of attracting the adherence of all states to this convention and determined to work strenuously towards the promotion of its universalization and its full implementation. As mentioned, we remain flexible on the wording and placement of this paragraph, and we had heard good editorial suggestions from Egypt yesterday in relation to the replacement of the word attracting. We are also open to strengthening the paragraph and will positively consider the suggestion presented by Indonesia. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Singapore for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Thailand.
Thank you, Madam President. First, we align ourselves with the ASEAN statement made earlier on Cluster 6, and I would like to add some national comments on this cluster. First of all, we underlined the need to have an absolute clarity in our draft text so that there will be no further future trouble in interpreting the text of this convention. So for this part, first of all, we support the idea of having an obligation for the state to encourage or ensure universality. So Article 13 should remain, and I think the text is clear enough. Secondly, we do not have any provision on accession, and we all agree that one of the goals of this future instrument is to have everybody in. That's the meaning of universality, especially those who are, for the moment, do not join us. And so we should have absolute clarity in that this convention will be open for accession, and we should have this article after the article on ratification and have something like any state which does not sign this convention before its entry into force may accede to it thereafter, something like that. Next, my last comment is on Article 19. We do see the merits of having this provision, again, for absolute clarity regarding relationship with other agreements. No possible room for interpretation. But all, interpretation must be within the text that we are drafting. That's the principle, but we do not think that it is wise to single out just one treaty, although the NPT is something like that we all agree is the most relevant to what we are doing now. So we would support a proposal by Malaysia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Mexico to use the language from ATT Article 26(1). Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the delegation of Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning. Permit me a little indulgence to commend your calmness and coolness, even in the face of all these barrages. So, but all the same, on easy lies the head that wears the crown. Madam President, my delegation would very much like to align with the issues raised earlier by the distinguished representative of Ecuador regarding the challenge we may have going forward with Article 19, especially regarding the explicit reference to the NPT. Let me begin by sharing a bit of an African proverb with us. Say, when a kid falls down, he looks to the front. But when an adult falls down, he looks behind. So looking behind for us is to ask that question: how did we get here? Part of the reason for us is the inability of NPT, the same NPT, to live up to expectations. You will indeed recall our comments on preambular paragraph 13, and when we aligned with Brazil, that we don't want any preference shown to any of these protocols, particularly when we know the challenges we've had over a period of time with them. So the noble way out for us would be to reference all those protocols related to removing nuclear weapons from our lives, including the nuclear weapon-free zones, which we so much prefer to be referenced properly, without any scale of preference drawn for any of them. Or, secondly, we looked at your proposal yesterday, but as long as the proposal would make no attribution to NPT in the way we have here. Or thirdly, just a few minutes a while ago, as clearly highlighted by the distinguished representative of Singapore, the proposal read out just a while ago, which we can all look at and see the way out. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Nigeria for that statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. The Philippine delegation believes that an article on decision-making is an important consideration for this treaty, particularly on procedures for general matters, matters of substance, and matters of procedure. An article on decision-making could facilitate overcoming the existing problems in many treaties, that even procedural issues of minor importance can get stuck in a deadlock or become the object of protracted consultations until consensus is reached. As a remedy, the Philippine delegation proposes to resort to voting when consensus cannot be reached. The value of such a modest step in the context of procedural issues should not be underestimated in terms of ensuring that our dynamics of decision-making remains proactive and thus not impede the progress of the treaty. The Philippine delegation proposes the following language to the article on decision-making. States parties shall make every effort to adopt decisions in the conference by consensus. If consensus cannot be reached, decisions shall be taken by a 2/3 majority vote of the states parties to this treaty present and voting. The wording to this proposal is with reference to the CWC. The Philippine delegation is open to other suggestions on the wording of the proposed article and is flexible as to its placement in the draft, perhaps after Article 11 or Article 12. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of the Philippines for that statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Peru, followed by Guatemala, Malaysia, and Argentina. Good morning, Madam President, and all of the delegations that are here today. The institutional part of the treaty is important for my delegation because the wording of these articles will affect the effectiveness of this instrument. In order to ensure an effective and strong instrument will be important for the impact and the success of it. In terms of Article 11, we believe that the text should be adjusted. Thus, we support Malaysia's proposal to establish that we would not accept amendments that would go against the goals and the purposes of this treaty. We also believe that it is interesting to consider the proposal for the first paragraph of Article 11. This is from the Cuban delegation to change the term maybe to shall. We believe that it is more in step with our goals in this paragraph. Article 13 on universality. On that point, we believe that the text should establish an affirmative obligation to all states party to the treaty to promote the norms that are established, including informing the purpose and its context so that it encourages other states to join the convention. And this would be based on the example of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Regarding Article 17 on reservations, my delegation supports the proposal that was very well put forth by Cuba, and that the reservations should not just be circumscribed to the articles of the treaty, but rather to the treaty as a whole. This is all for the moment. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Guatemala. Madam President, thank you. Good morning. I'm going to try to be as specific as I can. Article 11, Guatemala joins the rest of the delegation to support the Malaysian proposal to the reference regarding the proposed amendments as established in other instruments such as the ATT. In terms of Article 16, my delegation believes that 40 ratifications is a reasonable number. However, we believe that the number of ratifications that should be necessary before the coming into force of the convention could be reduced to 30. But we are flexible, and we will study the various proposals from the other delegations. In Article 17, like other delegations, we also believe that this article should not be amended. We agree with the language. Article 19. My delegation is also concerned. This legal vacuum is a problem. If we do not find better language, we would also join what was expressed by Ecuador and other delegations to propose the deletion of this article. Thank you. I thank the delegation of Guatemala for that statement. I give the floor to the delegation of Malaysia, followed by Argentina.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to all. We take the floor again just to comment on some issues which we did not mention yesterday, and also to react to some issues that were raised by delegations. With regard to Article 13 on universality, we do agree that this is very important to have. We are fine with the language that remains in the text, but in our understanding of the language, we see that what is called here is for the obligation to be on specific state parties. We feel that it's also important that universalization be done collectively. In that regard, we see that it would be useful later on as we discuss about the MSP to have universalization as one of the agenda items to be discussed for the MSP. We heard the Singapore proposal to have an element of universality in the preamble, and we see that's very positive, and that's something we can support. With regard to Article 18, on the question of the notification period, we can support the proposal by Liechtenstein and supported by Ireland and many other countries to extend that period from 3 months to 12. With regard to the proposal by Philippines on decision-making, this is something very interesting and something that we would consider, and we look forward to see what language would be proposed on that. Our initial reaction would be that when we speak about decision-making, it would be more in the context of the work that needs to be taken under the MSP or the REFCON. That being the case, if we are indeed going to have an element of decision-making within the text of the treaty, we see that it would be appropriate to look at that in the context of giving power and authority to the meeting of state parties or the REFCON to take decisions in the future, and not necessarily in its own separate article. Having said that, this is something that needs to be considered further as to whether it would indeed be necessary to have it explicitly in the article, in the convention, even if it is within the article on MSP, or is this something more to do with the rules of procedure for the MSP that should be discussed later on? But nonetheless, we see that it's a good point. With regard to Article 11, we are heartened by the support by a number of countries with regard that any amendments should not go against the principles and objectives of the Convention. That's good. At the same time, we wish to just simply emphasize that another aspect of our proposal was to strengthen the procedure in terms of how amendments can be made. And we have given language to you, Madam President, and it's within the compilation text, and we just wish to highlight that. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Malaysia for that statement, and I give the floor to the delegation of Argentina, followed by Brazil. Good morning. Thank you, Madam President. My delegation is speaking for the first time on these articles. We have very carefully followed the various proposals that have been made, and we believe that the majority of them truly enrich the draft of this treaty. On Article 19, my delegation's a priori position is to delete the article as it is. We understand that the strengthening and the connections with other treaties should be established in Article 3, 4, and 5, first and foremost, in this draft. But we were very carefully following Malaysia and Singapore's proposals, and we believe that we could support both proposals. But this we will consider later on when it is consolidated. But I would like to establish that article can be flexible vis-a-vis this article, and our position is based first and foremost on the Vienna Convention. So we believe that there's a logic there, and we also believe it should strengthen that tie in the articles that are most tied to verification and safeguards. So therefore, we are very carefully following the debate, and we will see how this concludes and how this is reflected in the draft treaty. Thank you very much. I thank Argentina, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil. Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning. From Brazil as well. I would like to We have, I think, a very good series of proposals here, and I think there's a great deal of convergence, and this helps us a great deal. This helps us make an important step forward in terms of achieving a second version of this text. However, I would like to make a comment on two specific proposals that have been made that I think were put forth, but perhaps were not discussed in depth. But in our opinion, these are proposals that could affect very negatively a future treaty, thus depriving it of its main goal of prohibiting nuclear weapons. I would like to refer to a proposal that was put forth by the Netherlands to include in Article 9 a clause that would subordinate the treaty to the NPT. And I believe that vis-a-vis this topic, Ecuador, our distinguished colleague, explained very well why it would be unreasonable, in our view, to accept such a clause. We are here to negotiate an independent, autonomous treaty that has a very clear goal of prohibiting to legal prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. The second proposal was put forth by Switzerland. I understand that this would also be to include in Article 9 a provision whereby the treaty would allow future states party to continue militarily cooperating with countries who are not members of the treaty and who do not uphold the prohibition established in the treaty. This article would be a version of an article related to the interoperability of the treaty. This exists in the CCM. But in this case, I believe that it would not be acceptable in light of the spirit and the goals of this treaty. I think it would not be proper to include such a provision or clause because this would create a very large vacuum, a kind of exceptionalism that could affect as a whole the effectiveness of this treaty in the future. So so Brazil would not be able to provide its support to these two proposals. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank Ambassador Patriota for that statement. We have no more delegates who wish to make comments on this cluster. So we can now move on to give the floor to civil society so that they can make their statements. So we would like to begin by inviting Mr. Sharon Dolev of ICANN.
Thank you, Madam President. We support the draft provisions on signature, ratification, and entry into force, as well as the provision disallowing reservations. We believe that any proposals to amend the treaty should be circulated to states parties well in advance of a decision on their adoption. And any amendment must, of course, be fully compatible with the object and purpose of the treaty. We welcome the inclusion in the draft of an obligation on states parties to encourage others to accede to the treaty with the ultimate goal of universality. In our view, the treaty should also require states parties to promote its norms and provisions, including by disseminating information on its content and purpose to elected representatives, relevant national bodies and public servants, its military and members of the public. Madam President, this treaty built on, complement and reinforce various existing legal instruments, including those preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons and those prohibiting other indiscriminate, inhumane weapons. A number of these instruments are rightly recognized in the draft preamble. We believe the draft Article 19 places undue emphasis on one treaty over the other. Finally, Madam President, we see no possible justification for a state party ever to withdraw from this treaty, given the grave threat that the nuclear weapon poses on humanity. The treaty should specifically state that no withdrawal is possible. We note that a number of other important treaties, including no less the Charter of the United Nations, do not allow for withdrawal. Our message must be clear. No extraordinary events can ever justify acquisition or use of nuclear weapons. The so-called supreme interest of a state can never be served by weapons of mass destruction. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Sharon Dolev from ICANN. Let me give the floor now to Dr. Matthew Bolton, the Pace University and the International Disarmament Institute.
Thank you, Madam President. This convention aims to stigmatize nuclear weapons. However, normative change does not happen by itself. It requires action by states, international organizations, civil society, faith leaders, and academia. Pace University's International Disarmament Institute has conducted research on provisions in relevant instruments regarding the universalization and promotion of norms they establish. Our detailed research can be found in working paper number 36, submitted to the conference. The current draft of Article 13 on universalization establishes important obligations to encourage other states to join the treaty. However, we encourage the conference to consider including provisions found in other instruments that provide additional avenues for diffusing norms. First, states may wish to consider provisions promoting respect for the norms among states not party. A model might include an obligation drawn from the CCM to promote the Convention's norms and notify states not party of treaty obligations, discouraging violations of its prohibitions. An alternative model might be Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, in which states must respect and ensure respect for the prohibitions. Second, The conference should consider inclusion of obligations to promote and disseminate the norms to states, citizens, and military personnel. Precedent exists for this in other disarmament instruments. It could draw from language suggested by Ireland and the Holy See in the preamble, calling on states to support activities of disarmament education, awareness raising, and the fostering of a culture of peace. Third, to ensure that these activities are given support, states may wish to consider including references to universalization and norm promotion activities in the preamble and articles regarding international cooperation and assistance, meetings of states parties, and transparency and reporting. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Dr. Matthew Bolton from Pace University. I give the floor now to Alimhan Akhmetov from the Center for International Security and Policy Studies of Kazakhstan.
Thank you. Madam President, distinguished delegates, first of all, let me express my gratitude to the authors of the draft convention for your work. We have made another step towards the prohibition of these inhuman weapons. We sincerely hope that the states will manage to agree and approve the text of the draft convention during the second session of the conference. At the same time, let me draw your attention to the following. The draft convention on the prohibition of nuclear weapons seeks to address two issues: the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Aspiration to address these issues in one document, in our opinion, causes many questions. For example, attracting the IAEA. These may lengthen the negotiation process and distract from the main objective of developing and adopting the convention, filling the legal gap on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We think it is important to stress that in our opinion the draft convention is aimed to formalizing the point of no return, the signing and entry into force the first international treaty on legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. Taking this into account, we think that a legally binding instrument on the prohibition of nuclear weapons should consist at least of two parts. These are complete and comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, Convention 1, let's say it, elimination of nuclear weapons, time frame and mechanisms of verification, as well as the establishment of a specialized agency for these purposes, Convention 2. In this regard, we think it is appropriate to reflect the Articles 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 10, and the Annex in the Convention 2. We think it is appropriate to include in the draft convention an additional article that, noting nothing in this convention shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to the convention to develop research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. The title of Article 18 is proposed to be outlined with the wording duration and withdrawal from the convention. Moreover, paragraphs 2 and 3 are proposed to be deleted and outlined in one paragraph with the following wording: withdrawal from this convention shall not be permitted. Taking into account that nuclear weapons threaten the very survival of humankind, the proposed standard wording on the right of state to withdraw from the convention to protect the supreme interests of the country seems rather absurd. Madam President, distinguished delegates, these and other equally important issues are outlined in details in the Center's working paper 31. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Akhmetov of the Center for International Security and Political Studies of Kazakhstan. We've concluded our review of the last cluster, Cluster 6, Articles 11 to 21 of the draft convention. In general, it is clear that we have maintained a significant level of convergence in the various proposals that have been put forth by the delegations, and there is significant space to build a revised version of the text. There are some topics that, of course, could and should be reviewed with greater attention and will require some time. Before concluding this stage of our first reading, there was even a comprehensive proposal to reword or change the structure of Articles 2 to 5. As we had mentioned before, this is a very important, a central part of this legal instrument. I have asked some delegations to please negotiate and come closer so that we can have a new proposal that we would be able to discuss. To that end, I would like to take this moment to explain to you the various adjustments in the revised version of the preamble. We will have to engage in some consultations with the Bureau, so we will suspend this session so that we can consult with the Bureau, and then we will return in the afternoon session and determine how we can engage in a review of these topics that were pending, so that we can resume our consideration of them and review them before being able to state that we have concluded the first reading of the text. As we have scheduled, this was included in the timeline. It was supposed to be concluded today, this afternoon, in fact. So, with your indulgence, I would like to take this moment to explain some of the adjustments in the preamble, in this first revised version of the preamble. And I would like to reiterate what I mentioned to you yesterday in the afternoon, that a member of the team, Ambassador Lozano, will be able to go to talk to the various delegations and receive some comments and reactions from you. And thus we will be more prepared and better prepared for a revised version that could be comprehensively included in a new full version of the text. We have the document in English. I am now going to give you this explanation in English as well.
As I mentioned yesterday, we received a total of nearly 36 proposals for new paragraphs by delegations. Therefore, in addressing the numerous suggestions for new language and paragraphs, I have incorporated those elements where there were more convergence and convergent views, and where the proposals could take the preamble closer to consensus. In the interest of keeping the preamble as focused and concise as possible, I have sought, as far as possible, to consolidate similar proposals, to integrate requests for new elements into the existing structure, and to strictly avoid any repetition of ideas, concepts, or elements in the text. But as I also mentioned yesterday, it has been also the interest of the presidency that the preamble can be as short as necessary, so that it can be similar to the preambles of comparable legal instruments. I have maintained a consistent approach in not elaborating in extenso the text or include the complete proposals that were presented in an extensive manner. Let me highlight some of the most significant changes and additions to this revised preamble. Paragraph 1 remains unchanged. In paragraph 2, we have tried to incorporate the notion of the risks posed by the continued existence of nuclear weapons, and included reference to the finding that the consequences of nuclear weapons cannot adequately be addressed by any state or institution. We have also reflected the notions that nuclear weapons pose a threat to the survival of humanity and of the impact and the impact of health of current generations, as was requested in the room. Paragraph 3 has been expanded to include reference to the unacceptable harm caused to the victims of nuclear weapons, as well as the recognition of the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapon activities on indigenous peoples. The section on international law and international humanitarian law, as many delegations suggested, this section begins with a reaffirmation of the need for states to comply at all times with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The paragraph on international humanitarian law has been revised and now includes references to all the various rules that delegations proposed should be included. The paragraph on the illegality of the use of nuclear weapons now includes a reference to the threat of use. The paragraph on the Martens Clause has also been substantively revised as proposed by a number of delegations. The third section of the preamble that builds the link with the United Nations and the disarmament machinery. In paragraph 7 remains unchanged, as in light of the methodology I explained above, I have avoided elaborating in extenso the text of well-known principles. But a new paragraph 8 reflects concerns over the slow pace of nuclear disarmament, the continued reliance on nuclear weapons in military doctrines, and the waste of economic resources on the development and maintenance of nuclear weapons. Former paragraphs 8, 9, and 10 have been completely revised following from the comments by delegations. The new paragraph incorporates various suggestions and now includes reference to a legally binding prohibition as a step towards the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent elimination of nuclear weapons. The paragraphs on general and complete disarmament and on the unanimous opinion of the International Court of Justice have remained unchanged, as the texts of these paragraphs are well known and come from the authoritatively and long-standing consensus documents. Quisiera hacer
I would like to give a more detailed explanation of the topic regarding the paragraph on the International Court of Justice. There was a discussion in the room. Several delegations expressed the need for the paragraph to refer explicitly to the court, to the advisory opinion of the court, while other delegations expressed the belief that since this advisory opinion has various components, it is important that this conference express a very clear view or of a clear expression of the will that states have to move forward. So there are some positions or views that an explicit reference to the court would entail a link with 1996, whereas there is an expressed desire on the part of the conference to express this will towards the future from here onward. This is a topic, of course, that could be reviewed in greater detail, but this aspect is present in our debate here in this conference.
Section 4, relationship with other instruments. The paragraph on the relationship with other instruments has been reorganized and consolidated along the lines of the many suggestions made by states. In its revised form, it remained possible to keep the various elements combined in a single paragraph, while adding a reference to the pillars of the NPT, which included disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, as well as a reference to the verification regime of the CTBT, which includes its international monitoring system as well as the other components of the regime, which will become effective upon entry into force of that treaty. Section 5 of the preamble deals with public conscience and the role of civil society. A new paragraph has been included on the importance of the equal participation of women and men in disarmament. In the final paragraph, as suggested by a number of delegations, new elements have been added to make it more inclusive, including references to other international and regional organizations, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, religious leaders, parliamentarians, and academics, as was suggested from the floor.
So in general, these are the proposals that we have sought to incorporate that reflect a significant degree of convergence at this stage in the room. In general, there has been a significant degree of convergence in our discussions, and this is something that we have tried to put forth in this first version. My colleague will be available to talk to you and hear your comments and suggestions, and we are now going to suspend the session so that we can have a meeting here with the Bureau, and we will return here at 3 p.m. so that we can conclude this reading, this comprehensive reading, this first comprehensive reading of the text. The Bureau meeting will take place in room 6, conference room 6. The meeting is adjourned. on this article in our national capacity because we are carefully following other proposals that was presented by Malaysia, for example, we think is very interesting. So because we think that it better organizes the various issues, but I think we have to be very careful. My delegation, Ecuador's delegation, did not come here to negotiate a protocol of another instrument. We came to negotiate a separate, independent instrument, even though it is, of course, related to and it is part of the larger architecture of nuclear disarmament. Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank the delegation of Ecuador for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Indonesia, followed by Venezuela, Mexico, Fiji, Singapore, and Thailand.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to everyone. Madam Chair, Madam President, allow me to make some brief comments on a number of articles that have been discussed since yesterday. On Article 11, we do support the suggestion made by previous delegations to make this article and as well as paragraph 1 and 2 to be more specific in terms of addressing the subject matter of this. For instance, there needs to be a clear subject as to who has the right to propose amendments. I think this should be specifically clarified. Secondly, on Article 11, I do support suggestions made by previous delegations to that amendments should be adopted more than 2/3. I think there was a proposal to have it 3/4, and this is something that we could live with. And then finally, on Article...
Conclude this morning meeting a little bit earlier so that I can engage in the consultations with the Bureau. So we will proceed as follows. We will first listen to the speakers who remained on the speakers list yesterday afternoon. We have Ecuador, Indonesia, Venezuela, and Mexico. I give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador. Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning to you. Good morning to each and every one of you. I would like to briefly refer to and react to a proposal that I heard yesterday regarding Article 19. We were very concerned in my delegation to hear that the proposal aimed to subordinate the treaty that we are discussing here to other instruments, particularly the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Once this treaty comes into it's as if once this treaty comes into force, it will not have its own life and it will not have its own legal independence, and this is a mistake from a technical perspective. But what concerned us most is that it was even stated that the new treaty, were there a conflict in terms of its interpretation, should be subordinate to the interpretation of the NPT. And we were worried about this because, unfortunately, a few states, due to their own interests, have interpreted the NPT in a way that we are completely in disagreement with. And I recalled that in December of 2006, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, mentioned at the Parliament, so it was not a personal statement, but rather an official statement, that, and I would like to read this in English for you. Under the NPT,
those who are the major nuclear powers can remain nuclear powers.
2 months later, the Prime Minister Blair once again at Parliament mentioned in February of 2007,
NPT makes it absolutely clear that Britain has the right to possess nuclear weapons.
Of course, I cannot state if that is the position, or if it still is the official position of the government of the United Kingdom or of other nuclear weapon states that are parties to the NPT, but we have heard these types of arguments and these types of interpretations. This interpretation is a mistake in our view. But there we have a question. Does this mean that the proposal that the NPT, or rather that the treaty that we are discussing right now and that will come into force, should be subject to that interpretation? My delegation is thinking, we're considering if the proposal regarding Article 19, should that proposal be eliminated from the draft? That is our question. Because it is complicating the discussion and it is generating confusion regarding legal realities. There are general standards for interpretation and general standards in terms of the coordination between treaties. Of course, we have not made a decision.
11, we do support the Irish proposal with regards to optional protocol, so as leaving us more room to discuss in the future for the possibility of having an optional protocol of this treaty. On Article 13, with regards to universality, we do support this current paragraph as it is drafted now, but we do believe that that this paragraph could be further strengthened as to make it more proactive. We do support the logic that was suggested by the delegation of Egypt yesterday to replace attracting with other words that was proposed yesterday. But on this specific paragraph, as I mentioned earlier, we do want it to make it more proactive. So we would like to propose one word in this paragraph, and that word is to promote. So not only to encourage states, but also to promote. So it would read as follows: each state party shall promote and encourage, so as to make it more proactive and so as to make it more engaging in terms of how we advocate the need to have complete universality of this treaty. Madam President, I'd like to proceed now to Article 18. We do subscribe the logic that was presented by the esteemed delegation of Liechtenstein on the need to simplify the paragraphs under Article 18. But I do want to register our view on this particular article, specifically on withdrawal.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, distinguished delegates. I call to order the 19th plenary meeting of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. At this point, the conference will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9 and Cluster 6, which includes Articles 11 to 21. From yesterday's meeting, 4 delegations were still on the speakers list to conclude this topic. I now have other delegations who are requesting the floor to discuss this topic. Once we conclude that list of speakers, we would then move to give the floor to civil society. Likewise, you have now had the opportunity to review the revised version of the preamble. I can now explain the modifications that were made. We can do this now together, and later on I think it will be necessary to consult with the Bureau so that, to the extent possible, this morning meeting, that we could conclude